right. Hello, we are Empathy Ambush, and this is our 2025 NASPA Case Study Competition submission. Just to give a little bit of background on us, we, Empathy Ambushed, are comprised of three second-year students from Clemson University's Masters of Education and Student Affairs program. I'm Kamariah Hammonds.
I'm Charles Hawes.
And I'm Kaylanii Mertin. Awesome. So before we jump into the case itself, we wanted to review the framework that we analyzed this issue through. So we'll be using the institutional intelligence model, which was designed by Dr. Michelle Botcher and Dr. Cristobal Salinas. So the institutional intelligence model is used to examine each contextual element when in a time of change at a higher ed institution. So the authors use a metaphor of a red onion and its layers to represent an institution. So the onion itself is the institution as a whole, and the individual layers are the different levels or different offices of that institution. So we've got a quote on the slide. The institutional intelligence model consists of three parts. First, our law and ethics. We must understand the laws that affect our work and how ethics, our own and others, and organizational ethics inform what we do and how we engage with others. So second, at the core of the institutional intelligence, which is what and how we develop information learned about our campuses and the role of law and ethics in our institutions. The third element is the foundational questions. So who, what, why, where, and how. These questions help us understand our institutional contexts. So using these foundational questions and combining them to understand law and ethics on our campuses, develop our institutional intelligence. So they also had said, while an organization has a shared mission, vision, history, and culture, those individual units also have a unique history, culture, and characteristics. So it's really important to keep all of those layers or levels in mind when managing these challenging situations. So we'll move into the elements of the case. So the first element is the state legislation, which calls for the elimination of offices and programs that exclude individuals due to their identities, which in turn the university responded by eliminating the two cultural student centers. Element two is Sumos Unidos, the student organization wanting to protest. Number three is freedom of speech and the university's outdated freedom of expression policy. Number four, a lack of institutional response beyond closing those two student centers after the legislation decision. Number five, the protest is slated to happen on the busiest day of orientation of the year, which will also be taking place in close proximity to the freedom of expression zone where the protest will be held at. And then finally, conflicting loyalties. So such as Susie Torres with a stake in both the orientation office and also her involvement with the student organization. And also Dr. Cristina Perez as a facilitator of a workshop during orientation, but also the faculty advisor of this organization, the student org. So next we'll take a look at these central and secondary issues here. So the central issue is students from Sumos Unidos and other like identifying groups are planning a protest, which we can say that it's expected to be larger than any that we've had before. And like I had mentioned, it's also in close proximity to orientation. So some of the secondary issues that we're seeing in this is the state legislation and potential legal threats, the freedom of expression policies that really need to be updated, the lack of experience with protests. So on campus, lack of experience with the safety, the spacing, and the traffic, but also the surrounding city may not be used to the influx of traffic there as well. The perceptions to prospective and matriculated students and families, since this is one of the busiest orientation days, we'll have a ton of prospective students and their families. And then dialogue with students going forward. So between those organizations, those student orgs, and the institution itself.
Okay, so to break these issues down even more, we wanted to look at the ethical and legal dilemmas that kind of spawn from our central and secondary issues. Our overall ethical stance is based on the beliefs of the institution as a whole, the Department of Orientation and the department that houses student organizations, and then also the student affairs professionals who work with our students. So ethically, we're looking at supporting students versus preserving the peace and brand of the institution, supporting current students versus catering to prospective students, providing a space to protest, keeping everyone safe, and then the split loyalties amongst students and staff. We're really trying to preserve the loyalties among those students and staff, as noted by Susie Torres. Um, and then also we move into the legal dilemmas. So legally, as we are a public institution, we have to ensure that we're following the law. So the new DEI legislation that's going to be going into effect July 1st. Um, freedom of speech, we obviously want to make sure that our students are exercising their rights to protest. And then also the requirement to change offices that exclude identities. So within this new legislation, it is stated that any offices or programs or practices that exclude individuals due to their identities need to be removed. And so moving into what theory to practice looks like when navigating these dilemmas, we wanted to focus on 5 specific competencies that encompass the major legal and ethical issues that our student affairs professionals will kind of need to dig into in order to properly navigate these situations. And so those competencies are advising and supporting, law, policy, and governance, personal and ethical foundations, social justice and inclusion, and then also values, philosophy, and history. And since the population of this institution is predominantly Hispanic, we thought it would be vital to include Torres' model of Hispanic identity development. It seems that the current members of Somos Unidos have a strong connection to their cultural identities, and it's caused them to create strong relationships with other Hispanic identifying students on the campus. However, with the new law being put in place, this will greatly impact future development of Hispanic students as they'll need to find different ways to explore their culture and then also create relationships with those who hold similar identities. And we also decided that the inclusion of a social justice framework was important to mention, specifically due to the content of the issue. Though Hispanic students may not be the minority on this specific campus, they do hold a generally minoritized identity, which is being targeted by this new state legislation, my bad. Um, this framework allows for the rebuilding of relationships between students and the institution, as well as empowering students to challenge institutional decisions through the facilitation of student affairs professionals. And this ultimately leads to the protection of the students' rights and freedoms. So now that we've established the background context and expanded on our elemental frameworks, we kind of want to give a quick overview about the stakeholder relationships. We've referenced some of them already, such as the institution and the state due to the nature of the institution type. But most of our other relationships will be discussed in further detail in the upcoming recommended approach sections. But overall, we just wanted to be cognizant of the relationships that we have and how they'll be undoubtedly affected by this series of upcoming events.
And now we talk about our approach. We have a 3-step recommended approach that we'd like to portray. And we approach this as if we were university consultants, whether that's outside the university or as a part of CSC. And it starts with our administrative stance. This is something that we think is an opportune time for the administration and student protesters to work hand in hand. And so we want to ideally have Dr. Regina Wallace, the Dean of Students, to put forward this stance. While there has not been a protest of this scale on our campus before, we want to welcome this method of civil engagement. We are proud of our students for organizing themselves and making their opinions heard. We want to support action, engage with it, and recognize it as a positive facet of the CSD experience. Ideally, working with Dr. Regina Wallace and hopefully mediated by Dr. Christina Perez, if she's willing, to ensure that the protest goes smoothly with representation and support from administration would help to make this a smooth occurrence on our campus and make it so that it does not interfere with orientation, which leads right into our second step of our approach. Our immediate response is important because we have a lot to do before the actual protest occurs on the day of orientation. The main thing we want to do is meet with the student leaders, such as Jose, with representation from administration, such as Dr. Regina Wallace, Dr. Christina Perez, and ideally Ross Barkley in orientation as well, because we want to discuss the plan with these students who are organizing it and offer support in the forms of safety measures and technology. So this is going to be a much larger protest than we've ever had before. How are we working with traffic flow? How are we working with students who are going to be there? Protesters, are they going to be, do we have enough space for them? Are there any fire hazards we need to consider? Things like that. We want to make sure that we're offering the students the option to be on the ground floor of that, so that it doesn't feel like we're bringing security forces in to control them, but more of we're helping to facilitate the inaction of the protest. If they need technology, can we provide that for them and make sure they have a platform to speak with, sound equipment or something like that? We also want to use this opportunity to establish clear expectations from both sides for how the protest is going to affect our freedom of expression policy, since we've discussed that before, and also the nearby orientation activities, why Ross should be there. If this protest if we're on the same page, we can make sure that these things don't touch on each other without us being aware of it ahead of time. And we'll talk about that a little bit later about how our orientation might do that. And we also want to make sure that we have faculty and administration representatives at the protest so we can be involved in the discourse, rather than just it being students who are railing against the university and presenting that as the approach that they're using. We can actually have faculty being there to be part of the conversation. If there are speeches as part of the protest, maybe faculty can share, hey, we're also passionate about this and we want to make the change too. And we realize there are some things that are preventing it from happening, but we are on your side as well. So it doesn't feel like a one-sided students versus the university. When it comes to orientation, we also want to give this as an opportunity to acknowledge that the protest is happening and not hide it in a corner of the university, and promote that CSC is a school that supports its students, so that students who are prospective students realize that they would have agency on campus. And if we have a lot of Hispanic identifying students, such as our large majority population is at CSC, they see themselves being represented and supported in that identity. Obviously, if there are events part of the orientation that might need to go through the space of the protest or are too close to it, we do need to logistically reroute or reposition them, not to hide the protest again, but to make sure that we are still able to carry out orientation to its fullest so that they also have a great day of prospective engagement with the university. And we want to make sure that students who are working in orientation and also align with Somos Unidos, such as Suzy Torres, have that flexibility, or Dr. Christina Perez, to be able to speak with supervisors or speak with the people they work with and find a solution that works for them. So making sure that Suzy and Ross can figure out where her role plays in all this. Dr. Perez would be a lovely option for us to have to either speak the protest, as well as usually do her fan favorite session in orientation, which she usually does. And if she's willing to do both, that would be great, because she has a foot in both camps. And she might be a great mediator to have on hand to explain either which way or the other things are happening to the people that she is able to speak to. We think that this holistic and united approach would build a lot of goodwill with the protesters towards university and admin, which they don't have a lot right now because of the closing of the centers. But this might be a good step in the right direction. Finally, we have our third approach, the third step of our recommended approach, which is the future actions. What comes after, right? One, we want to make sure that we update the freedom of expression policy. We're going to learn a lot from this protest. We're going to have something that's on a scale we've never seen before, and we can use that to inform, along with benchmarking against other institutions, how do we do protests going forward? We know that with the new laws coming in July, this is going to maybe be a more common occurrence. These things might show up more often, and so we need to be prepared for that. And this can be our learning opportunity for all of us. Initially, after gathering insights from the protest, we want to set a time to have a dialogue between students and administration to discuss what the future looks like. We know that we had to close the Hispanic and Black Student Center, or the Black and Hispanic Student Centers were closed, but perhaps we can reopen a multicultural center, which follows the official language that does not have any of that DEI language that would cause it to run up against the bulwark of the law, but it still meets the needs of the students of Somos Unidos in spirit. This would be a conversation that would ideally be, again, mediated by Dr. Cristina Perez, and maybe has Dr. Regina Wallace and Jose from Somos Unidos there to facilitate a conversation with a lot of students and faculty about how do we solve this and how do we provide the needs for everyone going forward. This is not a Hispanic-specific legislation issue. It affects all the identities that are held by our students on campus. And so we really want to talk about, are we meeting those needs going forward? Now, we also have to consider what are the potential consequences of this? Of course, extreme disruptive protests could happen. We think that we're minimizing this by the involvement we have on the front end, working with the protesters, establishing expectations and building that goodwill. We, of course, have media attention, which will always come with any protest on a college campus. But if we have a similar answer that both our protesters and our universities are giving, or the administration that is giving, that we're on the same page, that might help a lot in terms of that it's not one side against the other. It is a joint effort to improve our position for our students in amidst the larger cultural climate. We also want to consider our alumni. Of course, we are a young institution. We don't have a lot of alumni, about 20 years worth, but if our alumni demographics reflect our current student makeup, we want to make sure that we are supporting our students in light of the new legislation in a way that demonstrates our commitment to them and our matriculated students as well. And finally, our temporary and long-term effects of the campus climate. While this protest is clearly a response because students feel like they lack support from the university, we want to make sure that we are engaging with it and we show the support of our largest demographic of students, both past and present, and going forward, because we're going to keep seeing more of this as we go forward. And we want to make sure we are keeping our finger on the pulse of our university and responding to our students' needs as they come up. Thank you very much. This has been Empathy Ambush on our case study. If we hope that you enjoyed our presentation, and we also like to share our references with you if you have any questions about those.